let's talk about chemical changes and chemical properties. You'll want to have watched the video on atoms and molecules before you watch this one. So you'll want to think about chemical changes as though they're chemical reactions, because when someone says a chemical reaction, they're really referring to a chemical change. When you have a chemical reaction, bonds are going to be broken and bonds may be formed as well. And your atoms are generally going to be reorganized, and really sort of the take-home message here is that the identity of your substance is going to change. So when you have a chemical change, you're really looking at an identity change. Whatever you started with is changing into something different. And you can see here in our picture, we start with some oxygen, O2, some oxygen molecules, and some H2. So in both cases, here I have oxygen bonded to another oxygen, and here I have hydrogen bonded to another hydrogen. And we react them together to make water. And so we had to break that oxygen-oxygen bond, and we had to break the hydrogen-hydrogen bond to make a new bond between oxygen and hydrogen. In fact, we had to make two of those for each of the OH bonds in water. So in this chemical reaction, I broke some bonds, I made some bonds, and I started with things, oxygen and hydrogen, they're very flammable. And I made something, water, which is not flammable. And so we know then, based on just some common sense observations, that what I started with is not the same thing as what I ended up with. And so we can say, oh yes, this is definitely an example of a chemical change. There are some general types of chemical changes that you might run across. Combustion, burning, is one of them. Oxidation, you might think of that as rusting, like if you put a piece of metal outside in the weather, eventually it rusts, depending on the type of metal, or oxidizes. And then digestion. And in each of these cases, you want to think about the fact that what you start with is not what you end up with after the change has occurred. So the classic example here is you may eat an apple, but you don't eat poop, because it's not the same thing. So chemical properties are simply a way of talking about those chemical changes. So this is the manner in which the substance does or does not participate in a chemical reaction to form a new substance. So the chemical change is the process, and the chemical property is whether it does or does not. So we might say that water has the property of not being combustible. And we might also say that water does not burn. So in one case, burning would be an example, or not burning, of a chemical change, while we're talking about water having the chemical property of not being combustible. So for example, do the following statements describe a chemical property of aluminum? And the question here isn't getting at whether you know about aluminum or not, it's asking you to decide whether each of these are chemical properties or not. So the first one says it's a solid at room temperature. Then we have it dissolves in acid to produce hydrogen gas. It's a good conductor of electricity, and it reacts easily with oxygen in the air. So take a moment, think about what you know about chemical properties and chemical changes, and decide which of those you think is a chemical property. Or maybe there's more than one. Okay, so this first example, the solid at room temperature, that's not telling me that aluminum is reacting with something and changing its identity. It's giving me an observation, but it's not an observation of a chemical property. So this is a no. Dissolves in acid to produce hydrogen gas. Okay, so we've got aluminum, we've got acid, and we're making hydrogen gas, which is different than aluminum and different than the acid. So this is telling me, yes, something's happening. Something involving a chemical change is happening. Next, we have a good conductor of electricity. So that's just telling me that it can pass electricity through it. It's not telling me that the aluminum changes when the electricity passes through it. So this would be no. And then finally, reacts easily with oxygen in the air. And this was the easy one of the four because, hey, look, it says reacts. So this is definitely a yes. It is an example of a chemical property. Now, if we had said that it did not react easily with oxygen in the air, that would also be a chemical property. Even though we're talking about it not doing something, that is also a chemical property.